Gideon Moi was at State House and he met with President Ruto. Now this tells you that politics is not just what you see. The real strategy in politics is in the boardroom, and President Ruto here is a master. Observers and political analysts did not anticipate this, but we are seeing it unfolding that President Ruto has prevailed upon Gideon Moi. First on the table when Gideon Moi was at State House was the issue of senatorial race in Baringo. You all know that there is a by-election in Baringo and Gideon Moi was actually contesting. But as I mentioned, President Ruto had to do whatever possible to make sure that he prevails upon Gideon Moi to drop out of the race. And finally, KANU Secretary General has confirmed that Gideon Moi will not be contesting. That is the first thing. Daily Nation reports Gideon Moi bows out of Baringo senatorial by-election as his supporters protest. KANU Secretary General George Wanaina confirms the party will not field a candidate. Move follows Wednesday meeting with President Ruto. This is what I understand. He did not just drop out of the race. President Ruto must be having a plan for him. And in most cases, if President Ruto tells someone, don't do ABCD, he always makes sure that he compensates. So in this case, Gideon Moi must have bagged something. Perhaps a future appointment, especially after President Ruto has been re-elected, or just protection of his interests. This State House meeting brought victory to President Ruto. First, President Ruto is now in a position to consolidate the entire Rift Valley vote. Understand that Gideon Moi was to some extent another center of power, especially in South Rift. But him now being in President Ruto's circle, it now implies that across Rift Valley, there is only one center of power, and that is President Ruto. Now, as other regions also move to consolidate their votes into one basket, it also makes sense that President Ruto does the same, because 2027 is a high-stakes race and Rift Valley cannot accept to lose the presidency. That's one thing we must all agree. As much as people talk about one term, but we should also agree that Rift Valley is not ready for that conversation, because the focus here is to make sure that President Ruto serves his 10 years in office, the way Uhuru did. We've not reached a point where people really just talk about issues. It is about power. Sometimes you may have power but fail to deliver, but that does not mean that you must lose that office, because we've not matured politically. We are not people who are ideologically driven. We are driven by, community interest, ethnic interest, and all that. So at some point, community interests supersede national interests. So Rift Valley cannot have a conversation that President Ruto should just serve for 5 years. No, the focus is to make sure that President Ruto stays in power for 10 years, the way President Uhuru did. After that, then people can have a conversation. Where should the presidency go to? In my previous video, I talked about President Ruto's strategies to outsmart the opposition. And one of these strategies is co-optation, where you bring in those you disagree with into your fold. And President Ruto is good at that. When President Ruto sets his eyes on something, because he understands he can leverage that politically, he makes a move. And here he has made a move that places him strategically ahead of 2027. Now, by having Gideon Moi, President Ruto now is in a position to make sure that there is media control to some level. We understand that media freedom is important for our democracy. But looking at how the standard media has been on President Ruto, for sure, it has been so hard-hitting. So KANU UDA alliance will make sure that the standard media goes a little bit soft on President Ruto, as this statement states. However, I can't really confirm if this press release is true. Homa Bay Township MP, that is George Kaluma, shared it on X. Now, statement by Honorable Gideon Moi to Standard Group Media: stand down. In recent months, I have openly urged Standard Group Media to hold the government accountable and to speak boldly in defense of the public interest. That call was made in the spirit of a vibrant democracy and active opposition. However, the political landscape has evolved. With the new understanding between KANU and UDA, we are entering a season of cooperation aimed at uniting the country and advancing a shared development agenda. In this new context, I am asking Standard Group to stand down from its previous posture of heightened criticism toward the government. The time has come for responsible engagement, one that promotes stability, reconciliation, and progress for all Kenyans. Freedom of the press remains vital, but it must now serve the higher purpose of national cohesion and constructive dialogue. Let us move forward together, building bridges, not walls. Honorable Gideon Moi, Chairman, KANU, Nairobi, Wednesday, October 8th, 2025. I've always insisted that one-term team, if you don't change the strategy, then one term will just be sloganeering. And also for the Gen Z, if you don't prepare well, your clamor for change will just be an online discussion. That will be X, that will be TikTok, and that will be Facebook. That you'll talk about change and change and change, but that change will never come. Because looking at even IBC new registered voters, young people for sure are not registering in droves. And here, President Ruto is consolidating his team for 2027. And President Ruto knows how to do it best. So if you also do not plan well, then President Ruto will teach you what politics is. I am not lying. I am not trying to overemphasize. I am not trying to sensationalize this, but I'm just stating facts that if you don't plan strategically, then you lose 2027. And that means President Ruto will be re-elected. What do you think about KANU UDA understanding, as Gideon Moi calls it? You're watching No Lie with Owen.